Okay, let's get started. I'm Jeremy Cliffe. I'm Editorial Director and Senior Fellow at ECFR. And I'm going to start very briefly with a scenario that will set up our conversation before I introduce our speakers. Imagine it's 2028. Western intelligence agencies have come to an alarming conclusion that China is preparing to impose a maritime blockade on Taiwan as a prelude to an invasion. Questions ricochet around European governments. What tools of economic statecraft do they have at their disposal? How can they increase the costs of any conflict? And in particular, how can they learn from that previous shocking morning 6 years previously when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent events? That is a scenario that is, of course, far from certain. It's a hypothetical, but it's one that inspired an excellent new policy brief by my colleague Agathe Demarais on the lessons of the sanctions following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine for any potential Ukraine conflict. And my colleagues will be dropping the link to that into the chat on this webinar for you to read. And obviously, I encourage you all to do so. So I'm very pleased to be joined by Agathe for this conversation. Agathe is Senior Policy Fellow for Geoeconomics at ECFR. She's leading our burgeoning work on geoeconomics, on those links between economic policy and geopolitics, be it trade, sanctions, de-risking, you name it. So it's really great to have her here. Thank you for joining us, Agathe, and thank you for your work on the paper. And we're also joined by my colleague, Jeremy Shapiro, who's Research Director and Director of our new US program. Jeremy is also the co-host of the new podcast Swamp Chronicles on US politics, and he's joining us live from the Washington Swamp. So thank you for doing that, Jeremy. This is a two-Jeremy webinar, some of you may have noticed. A few bits of housekeeping before we launch into this conversation. This is a public on-the-record webinar. We will be putting a recording of the webinar on our website and on YouTube shortly after we go off air. And there will be a brief Q&A at the end of this. So you can post your questions at any time during this conversation in the Q&A box, which you should find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So please do drop them in there. With no more ado, let's get going. Agathe, I'd like to start with a question for you. I mean, this paper is really a user's manual for Western governments that applies all of those lessons from the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine to this hypothetical scenario. And I want to kind of you to imagine that you've got maybe you're on a relatively generous lift ride or elevator ride with a European senior policymaker, and you wanted to convey the top points from your analysis to them. What would those be?
Thanks so much, Jeremy, and I'm delighted to be here today with you all. Thank you. So essentially, what would I say to this European policymaker on the left? Well, I would say first that there is an interesting parallel to make between the Russian and Chinese economies, and that's pretty much a scene setter, something that I would like to mention. Because we have sanctions targeting Russia, and in the hypothetical scenario that you've mentioned, we would have European sanctions targeting China. And these are similar economies in some respects. These are big economies. Russia was the 8th or 9th largest economy in 2022 when it was targeted by massive Western sanctions. These are large exporters with a big current account surplus. And also these are both countries that have been at odds with Western economies for quite a while and that have invested heavily into sanctions proofing or sanctions vaccination. We'll go back to that. We have lots of metaphors with medical stuff in this policy brief. So that's the first thing that I would say. We have some parallels, and that's why it's so interesting and so important to take a look at Russia sanctions lessons. There are two caveats though, and I'm keen to make this lift ride very generous. There are two caveats though, and these are related to the scenario you mentioned. The first one is that we are assuming for EU sanctions to be applied against China in this scenario to prevent an invasion, that we would have political agreement between EU member states. And of course, that's a very high bar, but we're going to focus on economics here, not on the politics. And the second caveat is that we wouldn't be looking at salami slicing tactics with China achieving small territorial gains around Taiwan with some small events, but really at a full-blown invasion, because this is the only scenario that would trigger EU sanctions against China. So now on to the three lessons. The policy brief has 5, but I think that if we pick 3, the 3 most important lessons that I would mention are, the first one is deterrence can probably be useful if it is done right. It's very hard to get sanctions deterrence right. It's also very difficult to know if sanctions deterrence has worked because we don't have access to the counterfactual afterwards. But it's pretty clear that in 2022, it wasn't a huge success. So should we think, okay, sanctions deterrence doesn't work, we shouldn't even try it, there's no hope that Western sanctions threats could change China's calculus around Taiwan? Well, maybe not, because there is a huge caveat to this analysis. Those sanctions threats that Western allies sent to Russia in late 2021, early 2022, did not include the most powerful measures that were eventually imposed on Russia. And I'm thinking here, for instance, of the EU embargo on seaborne Russian oil imports. We don't know if knowing about this embargo would have changed Russia's calculus, but this was a very powerful threat, and it wasn't part of the initial sanctions packages. So the first lesson is sanctions deterrence must include references to the most powerful conceivable threats that G7 allies could impose on China. The second lesson is probably related to this one, and it's about inoculation. I was mentioning we have tons of medical metaphors. What is inoculation? Well, inoculation is when you insert a small quantity of a harmless disease in a body or in an animal to make it immune to a deadlier disease. For instance, in the late 18th century, it was the invention of vaccination when a British scientist showed that inoculating cowpox in humans rendered them immune to smallpox, which was much deadlier. And this is something actually, when we take a look at Russia sanctions, well, maybe Western countries have inadvertently indulged in sanctions inoculation. I'm going to give one example here that highlights why Western countries would need to go hard and fast in the scenario that you've highlighted. In 2022 and early 2022, Western economies cut off the access of 7 Russian banks to SWIFT. And at the time, the hope was that this would deal a blow to the Russian economy, but actually it didn't. And the reason for that is that Russian banks could easily reroute transactions towards the hundreds of Russian banks that were not disconnected from SWIFT. And this highlights how this mild measure actually helped Russia to build sanctions antibodies, because in turn, what Russia did was double down on efforts to connect to SIPs, which is an alternative to SWIFT, the global Rolodex of banks. So I think sanctions inoculation should be prevented, which means going hard and fast, is the second lesson. And then finally, the third lesson is about sanctions proofing. There's no doubt when we take a look at the data that China is supporting, in part, Russia's war effort with some shipments of dual-use goods from China to Russia. But one would wonder, why can't Western countries, the US, the EU, do something about it? Why can't they impose sanctions on the firms that are facilitating these exchanges? Well, the reason for that is that these exchanges probably take place through small banks that do not use the US dollar, that maybe do not use SWIFT. And that highlights how Russia and China's efforts to sanctions-proof their economies will gradually decrease the effectiveness of sanctions. So I think that if we take a look at this scenario in 2028 that you've mentioned, there is a very high chance that financial sanctions on Chinese, for instance, financial institutions would not work very well. And so all taken together, I would say the 3 lessons for this European policymaker are: 1, include the most powerful sanctions threats in sanctions deterrence packages; 2, avoid sanctions inoculation, which means going hard and fast; and 3, beware of sanctions proofing.
So we're getting a lesson in virology as well as sanction politics. That's a great introduction. I mean, let's go straight to kind of one of your key conclusions in the report, which is that Europe might actually have most leverage over China applying these lessons to the Taiwan conflict scenario when it comes to market access. Now, that might surprise people who are expecting that perhaps sort of financial sanctions or asset freezes would be where Europe could impose the most pain. Why do you focus on that?
Well, I would say that the policy brief focuses on that exactly for the lessons that we've mentioned. We need to go hard, we need to go fast. And the final part of the policy brief's title is "and where it hurts." So the key question here is, where would it hurt China most? If we take a look at the tools in the economic statecraft toolbox of Western countries, we have financial sanctions, unlikely to really make a difference. We've just discussed that. We have export controls, restricting access to key Western technology. Well, China is really doubling down on efforts towards tech self-sufficiency. So maybe it won't be there by 2028, but still, it's doing not too badly on this front. And so that leaves the third tool, trade measures, the good old trade measures, such as trade blockades, for instance. So that's where it would hurt China. And actually, this comes from a simple observation. The reliance on exports is probably the Achilles heel of the Chinese economy. The Chinese economy relies on exports, it's 20% of China's GDP, as the engine for its economic growth. And so if we leverage this Chinese reliance on exports as a key driver of economic growth, we also see that the EU is critical here, and that if the EU were to impose measures targeting access to the EU market for Chinese firms, well, these measures would have a huge impact on the Chinese economy. Why is the EU so crucial here? Well, the first reason why is because China probably wouldn't be expecting the EU to go for such trade measures. Precisely because what we've seen also with the Russia case is that adversaries typically do not expect the EU to go for very powerful measures. We go back to this idea of the EU ban on seaborne Russian oil imports. Russia probably didn't expect that. And China would probably make the bet that it could divide European member states on the topic. So China wouldn't expect EU measures. The second reason is that the EU actually accounts for China's largest trade surplus. China has a trade surplus with the EU that is equivalent to China's trade surplus with all developing economies combined. That's really huge. That's really important for Chinese economy and Chinese firms. And then the third reason why is maybe a bit counterintuitive. You know, we hear a lot about US de-risking or decoupling plans from China. And when we take a look at the data, US trade reliance on China, well, on paper, we can go back to that in the Q&A, is decreasing. US imports from China have decreased by 5% since 2029. Meanwhile, this is not really happening in Europe. In Europe, Europe talks a lot about de-risking, but it's not happening in practice. What we see is that EU imports of Chinese goods have increased by 42% since 2029. That highlights why the EU will remain a key market for Chinese firms, probably by 2028. So how do we put that leverage in practice? Well, blanket bans, blanket trade blockades on all Chinese goods are not an option. They would be tremendously impactful and harmful for European economies. We see that a number of European industrial sectors rely on Chinese intermediate inputs or machinery. These account for about 60% of EU imports from China. But we have another option, and it is targeting EU imports of Chinese finished non-critical consumer goods. What are we thinking of here? Well, electronical appliances. I'm thinking of kettles, lamps, fridges, stoves, and also low-end goods, which are critical to Chinese exports. These represent around 10% of Chinese exports. What are low-end goods? Well, clothes, footwear, toys. And when we take a look at the data, we see that such narrow and probably manageable for EU economies import bans would target 10% of Chinese exports, or if all G7 EU allies are on board, 20% of Chinese exports. That is hugely significant because it could have a tremendous impact on the Chinese economy, fuel bankruptcies, unemployment, and possibly threaten social stability. So that's the idea. The entire policy brief tries to show that the EU probably has more leverage than it thinks, and that Europe's greatest leverage probably lies in market access.
And that touches on secondary sanctions and sanctions evasion, which is something I hope we can come on to later. But now let's go to Washington and Jeremy to get your perspective on this, because Agathe's already set out that the assumption here is the idea that the Europeans have united around a certain position, which is a separate debate, I guess. But how much do you see the US and Europe uniting around a certain position, or really aligning on this agenda more generally?
I think it's been fairly tricky so far. The scenario that Agathe describes is a relatively undemanding one for transatlantic unity, and which I think is, it's appropriate for trying to understand what's possible. But as she pointed out, it's not necessarily how it's going to go. The from a U.S. perspective, that scenario is a war scenario. It's technically true that the U.S. has a strategic ambiguity approach to Taiwan, and it is not, maybe contrary to common belief, it is not committed to defend Taiwan under all circumstances just because it's attacked by China. There's no such security guarantee. But what the U.S. promised to Taiwan is essentially that they will defend them if there is an aggression which the U.S. views as inappropriate, China's fault in some sense. And that's, no one knows what that means, including the Taiwanese and the Americans. But as it's been evolving over the years, I think that there's been a bipartisan move toward making that somewhat less ambiguous. And of course, actually, Joe Biden 3 or 4 times during his presidency accidentally erased the policy of strategic ambiguity, and then his staff sort of walked it back. So I think we can be fairly certain that in the type of scenario that got put into her paper, that the U.S. would basically go to war with China. And that's an immensely serious thing, obviously. It has a couple of different consequences from a European perspective. The first is that, as we saw, maybe another lesson from the Ukraine war is that the U.S. would, in the first instance, wage a battle of narratives, and the battle of narratives would be very much aimed at Europeans, not only Europeans, but I think they would be the principal target. And one of the massive U.S. successes in the Ukraine war, and we take it so much for granted that we don't really even think that it happened, is that they were able to define the Ukraine war as a pure Russian aggression. And that involved some very, very difficult decisions in the run-up to the war about releasing intelligence, and it involved a lot of briefing to allies and taking quite a few risks in making predictions, which turned out to be true about the invasion happening, which made it impossible for the Russians to, for example, create a false flag operation and to create ambiguity about what was going on. And that had a massive impact, and I think you can see it in Agat's story, on the European sanctions and the European unity after the invasion happened. They would be doing the exact same thing in China, in a China case, really, and you would imagine there would be a counter-narrative effort from the Chinese. I think that would be absolutely essential. I think the second thing I think it's sort of implicit in Agat's scenario that kind of works. But I don't think even in the scenario of a blockade, we can take it for granted. The second thing to think about is the issue of U.S. Participation and the issue of U.S. military setbacks or just problems. There is something quite important in U.S. politics about the idea that soldiers or sailors might be dying in this event, and this is actually what we're talking about. The U.S. feels quite vulnerable in the military sphere in a Taiwan contingency. They are going to be, if they are contemplating going to war with China, this is going to be an absolute test of transatlantic unity, much greater, in fact, than either the Iraq war in 2003 or even the Ukrainian war in 2022, where it was a relatively easy sell because it was in Europe. I think that there is going to be an enormous amount of pressure on the Europeans to, particularly if there is actually military engagement, to stand behind the Americans politically. What does politically mean? It's hard to say, actually. There might not be that much pressure for actual military involvement because there's actually not that much that the Europeans can do and not that much what the Americans want. But political unity is much broader than that. And actually, I think the symbol of political unity in this scenario would be the sanctions. So this goes well beyond the question of whether they're effective or how to make them effective. Obviously, that's preferable. But the truth is the US will want sanctions effective or not. The US will want sanctions as a symbol of the transatlantic unity and as a way, even if they are more damaging to Europe than to China, that from a US perspective would be a feature, not a bug, because that would be demonstrating that the Europeans are sacrificing something and they are really in on this as an element of democratic alliance and transatlantic unity.
Well, on that, I mean, in the paper, Agathe, you talk about the likelihood of a transatlantic rift on secondary sanctions. You predict, based on the Russia-Ukraine experience, that the US would likely urge Europe to impose secondary sanctions on those trading with China. So in that situation, I mean, you have suggested that Europe wouldn't need or shouldn't even take that route. So could you explain why? And then I'd like to come back to Jeremy to hear his take on how the US might respond to that sort of rift.
Yes, and I'm sure Jeremy's take will be very interesting on that one, because I think there's a huge European-American rift on this topic. So in the policy brief, I argue that Europe would probably be under tremendous pressure to go down the secondary sanctions route against China in the scenario that we've outlined. And I can't agree with Jeremy Shapiro more when he says that Europe would really be under tremendous pressure from the US in this scenario that we've outlined. You know, while I'm talking about this policy brief with some contacts, some people would tell me, no, but you know, Europe won't go down the sanctions route against China. Even in this scenario, that's unrealistic. I think this is really underestimating the tremendous amount of US pressure in this scenario on Europe. So on the secondary sanctions question, what are we talking about really? Well, we're talking about ways for Europe and the US to make sanctions more effective against China in this scenario. And I think that here is something that is probably important to acknowledge, is that sanctions evasion would happen. It always happens. Evasion is just as old as sanctions. If you take a look at the history of sanctions, and that's not the topic of the webinar today, you can see that when you have a sanction, you have sanction circumvention. But I think that with the trade measures that we've discussed, circumventing these measures fully would be tremendously difficult for China for a number of reasons. Well, the first reason is the sheer amount of goods that would need to be hidden for sanction circumvention to happen. We're talking about hundreds of billions of Chinese exports every year to G7 countries. So that's very difficult to do. And then the second thing is that it is much harder to make imports covered in G7 economies than, say, export tiny microchips that can fit nicely in luggage, in hand luggage, that can go to Russia. So much, much more difficult. That being all said, it doesn't mean that sanctions evasion wouldn't happen. And so what would be the main options to try to tackle this? I highlight in the policy brief the fact that the best way to go would probably be to target financial institutions that are involved in sanctions evasion. And why is this? Well, because if we have such trade measures in G7 economies, sanction circumvention would almost certainly involve a Western bank. And so you could have two options. You could have friendly visits to banks involved in sanctions evasion to help them understand the philosophy of the rules, and they would get the message that sanctions evasion is not a great idea. Or you could simply put them under sanctions, and that would send a chilling effect throughout the entire banking sector. Escalating this measure would be imposing secondary sanctions. And I explained in the brief that from my perspective, these would be counterproductive. So what are secondary sanctions? Well, so far, only the US imposes such measures. Such measures seek to force all firms around the world in any country to make a choice between the targeted country, say Iran, and the US market. And so, of course, that's a no-brainer when you are dealing with a reasonably small economy like Iran versus a large economy like the US. But in the case of China, I think these measures would be ineffective at best or even counterproductive for three reasons. The first reason is related to what I've just said. China is a large economy. And actually, if we ask all countries around the world to make a choice between Western markets and the Chinese market, well, maybe many of them will choose China. That would be a very unpleasant surprise because China is already the largest trade partner of most countries around the world. The second reason is related to one of the lessons, the sanctions proofing lesson that we discussed only a few minutes ago. Shipments of Chinese goods to non-aligned economies, non-sanctioning economies, would probably involve non-Western banks, not be made in a Western currency, probably be done through SIPs, which is the Chinese alternative to SWIFT. In a nutshell, these would be very hard to track. So Western countries would need to dedicate a huge amount of resources, financial resources, technological resources, human resources to track these shipments. And that would be super tricky. And then finally, there's a more subtle reason. If we ask all countries around the world to make a choice between Western economies and China, and we tell those that want to stick to doing business with China, okay, you don't have access to our markets, we're not doing any business with you anymore. Well, that will play into China's hand, because China will reroute the exports that it cannot make anymore to Western economies towards these non-aligned countries. So I think this is why it would be counterproductive. But I'm pretty sure the US wouldn't accept these arguments, also because, as Jeremy's mentioned, there's the question of unity, of displaying unity. So I'm pretty sure the US would hate a European refusal to go down the secondary sanctions route.
I'll come to Jeremy just in a moment. Just as a reminder for those watching, if you want to drop a question in the question and answer box, please do. We'll come on to questions very shortly, and I'll put them to Jeremy and Agathe. So Jeremy, let's game out what Agathe talked about. How do you see a US administration responding to Europe, a Europe that follows Agathe's advice on secondary sanctions?
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe I want to back up a little bit because I think Agathe, she sort of at the beginning of this self-identified as an economist. I mean, what can I say? Some of my best friends are economists. But I would say that they tend to, and this is kind of in the name, look at things maybe a little bit too economically. I can accept all of Agathe's arguments about secondary sanctions in terms of how they would impact China. But frankly, I think most of the US officials would too. I don't think that that's actually that controversial, even here in the US. People understand that that the secondary sanctions haven't been terribly effective and maybe aren't worth the sort of political candle, the diplomatic candle that they're expending. But there's a bigger issue at stake here, and Agathe got at it at the end, which implies that she has moved a little bit beyond her economist training. I'm going to attribute that to her ECFR tenure. Is that that's not really, at the end of the day, what the US is after with particularly secondary sanctions, but actually with most sanctions. I mean, the Russia sanctions were a little bit unusual, and they were actually intended to do something. But actually, very often, sanctions are symbolic, and that's particularly true of secondary sanctions. So I think that the entire point of secondary sanctions from a US perspective would be to broaden the coalition of countries that are opposed to China in this scenario. That's exactly what they've been doing in Russia. And that's why it would be so essential from a US perspective that Europeans be on board with that. They wouldn't necessarily, I don't think they would disagree with Agathe's description of how little it would affect China. That's not the point. The point is to create this coalition against China, and actually to create some of the dynamics that she was talking about, to flush out the people who aren't on our side, to make them make hard choices, and to not allow people to sort of skate the middle. And that includes Europe.
Agathe, would you like to come back quickly on that response to the idea that sanctions aren't effective? It doesn't matter, they're political.
Yes, definitely. So first, I would say a lot of my friends are political scientists. So I agree with all of this. But the key question that I think Jeremy has highlighted here is whether G7 sanctions on China in the Taiwan scenario that we've highlighted would be for signal or for impact. And I would hope in that case that they would be for impact. And to me, that is the key thing. And when we take a look at what's been happening with Russia, we see that the US hasn't gone down the secondary sanctions route against Moscow so far. So far, US secondary sanctions only target the Russian military sector. And the reason for that is that these sanctions are for impact. So if you impose secondary sanctions against Russia, well, because Russia is a big economy and large exporter, you have ripple effects all around the world. That plays out against Western interests because you fuel resentment against the supposed, alleged negative impacts of sanctions. I'm sure we'll go back to the topic of disinformation at some point, but I think that you fuel this narrative against Western economies and against Western sanctions if you do that. The other reason, so you have these ripple effects that are tremendously important. Then the other reason that I think is important to keep in mind is if Western economies tell a number of countries, okay, we're cutting off economic ties with you, well, this plays out in China's hand. So it's not only that sanctions would be ineffective, it's that they would be counterproductive. And I think that this is the fine line. It's fine to have sanctions that are ineffective for signaling purposes, to display unity, to show that G7 allies are doing something. But I think there's really a huge difference when sanctions are counterproductive and Western allies are shooting themselves in the foot with these sanctions, and these sanctions actually benefit China. So I think that's the reason why G7 allies should avoid secondary sanctions in that scenario. They would actually have other options. In the policy brief, we discussed another option, which would be to signal to central banks in developing economies that they could lose access to currency swap lines for trade with Western economies, for trade in Western currencies. That would leverage the importance of G7 currencies in global trade. About 80 to 90% of global trade is denominated in Western currency. So for these economies, this would be hugely significant. It wouldn't be secondary sanctions, it wouldn't be applied very strictly, but it would still signal something. In other words, G7 countries would have options, and that also leads us to the question of the narrative. I think that for G7 countries, it would be tremendously important to wage this battle of narratives and to acknowledge that we would be facing a huge amount of Chinese disinformation about the alleged negative impact of sanctions. We've seen such Russian disinformation. We've seen Russian disinformation claim that sanctions are starving the world. This is entirely untrue, but we would be facing the same situation. So I think that this would call for a very, very careful response.
If time allows, it would be great to come back to you, Agathe, on building and sustaining a domestic base for sanctions within Europe, which is another very interesting point you cover in the paper. But we have a question I'd like to throw to you, Jeremy, first, which is how would a Trump victory impact this scenario? You mentioned a degree of bipartisanship on this matter earlier. How do you think it would change things?
Okay, I'll get to that. I did want to respond a little bit to what Agathe said, because I think her advice is very good, and I'd like to think that if I was a US policymaker, I would take it, or a European policymaker. So I'm not disagreeing with her exactly. I'm just pointing out that I don't think they will take it. And the reason for this is that it relates a little bit to the difference in the scenarios that she's pointed out between Russia and Ukraine and the Taiwan scenario that she's built here. This is a war that the US is in. And I can tell you, when you ask a US policymaker, what are your sanctions for, impact or politics symbolism, they will say both. And they will deny that there has to be a choice between those two things. So in the politics of basically going to war with China, I think that the demands for unity and all-out effort will trump these more sophisticated and true economic arguments, and so it's not a good idea. I totally agree with her, but as a scenario exercise, I think that this is where the US would go, and I think it's where they would insist that Europeans follow. And I guess maybe a further prediction would be that they would. But I totally accept all of Agathe's points about why that wouldn't be a good idea. In terms of the Trump question, so it's a little bit tricky. As I sort of started off by saying, there's a bipartisan consensus roughly on China, which is unusual these days, even on foreign policy issues. And we did a sort of breakdown of the Republican camps and primicists, prioritizers, and restrainers, and nearly all three of them. The restrainers are a little bit chary about this, but they're kind of keeping quiet because the domestic politics are so strong. Most of the Republicans that we talk to have roughly the same attitude as the Democrats and would take a very forceful approach. There may be an important exception to this, however, and that is Donald Trump, who may be president, and he has a strange view of China. His view of China is much less informed by the sort of peer competition thing, which seems to inform foreign policy specialists on both sides of the aisle, and is more about the trade deficit, is more about, doesn't seem terribly interested in Taiwan. And so I think that there is some possibility that a Trump administration well, first of all, they would definitely be seeking to avoid this scenario, but even in this scenario would be less bellicose, for better or for worse, than a Democratic administration. It's hard to predict, however, because it depends a lot on who Trump is surrounded by. And I think Trump, even though it would not be his instinct to go to war with China or anyone, I think he's quite genuine in his fear of that. And he likes to point out that he didn't start any wars. He was unusual for U.S. presidents in doing that. He seems to be confused as to whether it's happened before or not, but it hasn't happened since Carter, besides him. So that is, he would be quite worried about it, but it's very possible that the politics and his own advisors would overwhelm him in those circumstances.
Thanks for that. Agathe, I don't know if you want to come back on that, but I'll also throw you a question from Alberto, which is how the EU would manage the resentment of developing countries in the event of these scenarios. He asks, surely they would benefit from triangular trade, but are there options to either enlist or at least appease them? And I mean, I guess this is in the context of a vast global economic shock in the event of this scenario. I mean, you talk in the paper about, I think there's a Bloomberg estimate of 10% of GDP, global GDP, so double the COVID hit. Could you talk a bit about how you see the relationship with developing countries, and I guess particularly non-aligned ones that you've already brought up in response to that?
Very tricky, I think, is the summary. I think that we need to be very clear. There is zero chance that non-aligned economies would join the Western coalition sanctions effort. I think that this is absolutely clear. This is definitely what we're seeing with Russia today and with China, which would be a much bigger economy. I think that there is zero hope that non-Western economies would join the Western sanctions effort. And so that leads us to three questions. The first question is about, okay, these countries are not going to be imposing sanctions on China, but how can we try to prevent them from becoming sanctions evasion hubs? And that goes back to the question of targeting Western financial institutions involved in such sanctions circumvention networks. The reason why I think it would be much more useful to target banks than covered companies, front companies, is because it's much harder to get a banking license than to set up a front company involved in sanctions evasion. But we would need to be very honest and very candid here. Sanctions evasion would happen. It's really a game of cat and mouse. It's very difficult. It's a whack-a-mole game, essentially. So that would be difficult. But at least if they can avoid knowingly facilitating sanctions evasion, that would be a win. From a low bar, I admit, but that would be a win. Then there's the question of sanctions disinformation. And so it goes back to the point of Jeremy about the battle of narratives. And I think that the battle of narratives would start essentially in Western countries, because what we are seeing these days is a huge Russian disinformation effort regarding the effectiveness of sanctions. I always have a genuine question. If Russia thinks that sanctions are so ineffective, why does it care so much about them and discrediting them? But we're seeing a lot of disinformation about the alleged negative impact of sanctions on European economies in European economies. And so it really starts at home. And I argue in the policy brief that there's a real lack of knowledge about how sanctions work, what they can do, what they cannot do in general population. So to me, outreach efforts should really seek to explain how it works, what it can do, what it cannot do. That would be the first step. And then there is a question of getting the private sector on board, which I think would be critical. As a former French Treasury official, I think that I can also be honest, companies hate sanctions. They will always hate them and tell you they're completely impossible to implement. And well, that's their stance. But I think there would be several ways here to try to get them on board. The first one would be to make sanctions rule as clear as possible, because yes, when I take a look at sanctions lingo, sometimes I find it very difficult to understand. And so it's sometimes a bad faith argument for companies to say, we don't know what is possible or not possible under sanctions. But I think there is some merit to this argument. Then there's the question of forging informal relations between EU institutions, EU member states, and private firms. The US does that very well. OFAC, the US agency in charge of sanctions, has some informal outreach sessions. These are super useful for companies to forge informal ties with OFAC officials when they have a question. They know who to call. In Europe, it's not really done. And I think that this would be another way to try to get private firms on board. And then finally, there's the question of financial compensation. If firms are severely affected by a public policy, sanctions, because, for instance, their business model would rely on importing cheap Chinese goods, well, I think that there is a question to ask about potential financial compensation here. But then this would also be tricky because EU governments will need to avoid moral hazard, that is to say, taxpayers footing the bill when companies have made risky bets, in this case on China, and lost. So that would be difficult to manage. But I think it goes back to your point about the Bloomberg estimates that a conflict around Taiwan could wipe out 10 percentage points of global GDP growth. So that would be twice the hit of the COVID pandemic. And we saw huge financial package for supporting firms in Europe during the COVID pandemic. So there would probably be some scope here to try to have a think about such package.
Thanks very much. And I definitely recommend that everyone reads the paper, because Agathe goes into further detail about the impact on companies, consumers, voters, and how that can be managed in this situation. So it really looks at this from all points of view. We're running quite close to time. I don't know if either of you want to add any final thoughts on this before I wrap up. Jeremy, would you like to?
I have a question, actually, if that's okay, for Agathe. I'm a little bit confused about the deterrence question, which you focus on a lot in the paper, and I think it's a super important one, because frankly speaking, after heard the scenario, I just mostly want to avoid it. You said at one point that that it's important to sort of lay out that one of the lessons from the Ukraine thing is you really need to lay out what you're going to be doing. And that's as a principle of deterrence, and that we need to be able to say these things up front. But then later you say that that they won't expect, that one of the advantages of the trade measures is that they won't expect them, which seems to be having it a little bit both ways. And I'm trying to figure out which one is better. Which one do we need? I mean, should we be telling them that we're going to do these trade measures? Should we be, even though it will diminish that advantage, because deterrence is the more important goal? Or should we be putting that one in our back pocket so that it can be more effective in the moment?
We should definitely tell them. So the whole point of the brief is to try to alter China's calculus before an invasion takes place. And so the premise of the argument is to say China would be expecting US sanctions, possibly sanctions from other G7 countries, the UK, Canada, maybe Japan, but it wouldn't be expecting EU sanctions. And I think that if we have a think about how things would look like in the heat of the moment, because, in the run-up to an invasion, you would have these intelligence signals, everything would go in tailspin, G7 countries would need to respond in a hurry. Well, China wouldn't have factored in EU sanctions. And so it means that if at that very moment, the EU takes a look at this user's manual and says, oh, and by the way, we could restrict your shipments of goods for a number of sectors to EU and G7 markets, that would only be 20% of your exports. Think about it carefully. I think that this could be powerful. It wouldn't be a magic bullet. It's not a 100% certainty that it would work, but I think this would probably be one of the potential options to try to show China that invading Taiwan, the costs of an invasion are higher and crucially longer lasting than those that China would have already factored in. And that's the whole point of sanctions deterrence, saying to Russia or to China or to another country, okay, you want to do something bad? Well, you've probably, you have a game plan, this is going to yield reaction X, Y, Z, but you haven't thought about this one, and this one is going to cost you. It's going to harm your economy. So we should definitely signal that these measures would be coming.
So all the more reason for everyone to read your policy brief, I think, Agathe. Thank you both, Agathe Demarais and Jeremy Shapiro, for this great conversation. Thank you in particular, Agathe, for working on this, I think, clearly really important and foresightful paper. Certainly reading it, I was sort of struck by perhaps the biggest lesson of all from 2022 is just the value of reflecting on these questions well in advance and gaming them out and asking what things like sanctions are really for. So do everyone read it. It's in the chat here. You can also find it on the ECFR website. I've been Jeremy Cliffe. Thank you very much for tuning in, and have a good evening or afternoon or morning wherever you are.